Well, I hope everyone is excited about the program. I am not Kathy Radebush. I am Susan Trent filling in, getting my practice run, I guess, for next year. So let's start off. Welcome. Our invocation today, Chris Bandemer is going to give. So if Chris wouldn't mind coming up and doing that for us.
Today is Ratification Day, which officially ended the American Revolution. So because of that, I will read the New Colossus. Like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with the conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep ancient lands your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest tossed to me, if I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Today we are going to have a little bit of a switch in the program. Jim was not able to be with us today, so instead our own Mick McCollum is going to give his prior paper on wetlands. What are they good for? And as a quick reminder, don't forget to turn off your cell phones just so that we don't have that interruption during the program. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. As Susan mentioned, we found out at 8 o'clock this morning that Jim was tested positive for COVID, wasn't going to be able to be here. So I dug out an old Quest paper that I gave 15 years ago on wetlands. It's kind of related to glaciers, I guess. I'll try to explain why that is at some point during the paper. But we should have warned you about this before you paid for lunch and gave you a chance to escape. But if you will indulge me, I will try to get through this paper. My big disappointment was that there wasn't time for me to write a big embellished bio that Susan could use to introduce me. But there just wasn't time. So my paper, which I gave in 15 years ago, actually, in March of 2007, and the title of the paper was Wetlands, What Are They Good For? This was my third Quest paper. My first paper was on the mysteries of the Stradivarius violin, which I knew a little bit about. The second was on the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which I knew quite a bit about because I was actually in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. But with this paper, the program committee finally caught up with me. And this time I received a topic that I knew virtually nothing about. I received this, I knew nothing about wetlands. My impression was that they were muddy bogs full of smelly water inhabited by mosquitoes, frogs, and snakes, and that they were of no particular value. I also had the sense that wetlands were often used as a tool to stop development. But true to the mission of the Quest Club, I learned a lot while I was doing this paper. I have learned that wetlands are indeed populated by mosquitoes, frogs, and snakes, but they're also very valuable and enormously important ecosystems, and in fact, they're actually quite interesting, useful, and even beautiful. I hope I can pass on some of my newfound appreciation and interest in wetlands to you today. Like any good modern researcher, I started my learning process by going to google.com. I typed in wetlands, and amazingly, in just a few seconds, I received over 21 million hits of information. Technology is a wonderful thing, and keep in mind, this was 15 years ago. For the purpose of this paper, I would like to discuss three general areas. First, I will describe what a wetland is. how they function, and what role they play in the natural order of things. I will also try to answer the question posed by my paper's topic, what are they good for? Next, I will discuss some of the contentious battles that occur from trying to protect and preserve wetlands on the one hand, while trying to protect property rights on the other. And finally, I will tell you about a large, significant, and very exciting wetlands project here in Fort Wayne called Eagle Marsh. It is a project that provides many opportunities for your participation, support, and enjoyment. You may know, I was hoping she'd be here today, but Betsy Yankowiec, who's a quester and helped me so much on this paper, is the expert on wetlands here, and she's been involved in the Eagle Marsh and Little River project for years and years now. But I was hoping she'd be here today to keep me on track and answer any questions you might have. A simple definition of what a wetland actually is can be a little hard to get your arms around. It is primarily due to the fact that there are so many different types of wetlands. It is further complicated by the fact that many of the state and federal agencies that regulate wetlands and the many private organizations that have an interest in preserving them don't seem to share a common definition. Can you hear me in the back? I never did check. Good. However, two of the largest federal agencies that regulate wetlands, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency, do have a common definition. Quote, those areas that are inundated and saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support and under normal conditions do support a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soils. Did you get that? That sounds like a bureaucrat wrote it, doesn't it? Wetlands generally include swamps, marshes, bogs, and similar areas. That would be my definition. Wetlands can be identified by three primary indicators. They are habitat for plants and animals that have adapted to saturated soil conditions. The soils are usually saturated with water, and because of the saturation, have low levels of oxygen present, and water is present in quantities to cover or at least saturate the soil during the growing season. There are many types of wetlands, but for the purposes of this paper, I will mention only four very general categories. Emergent wetlands are mainly populated by grasses and plants, migrating birds, and small mammals that are often found there. Scrub wetlands contain small trees and bushes. The open water is used by ducks and songbirds and some larger animals that also make it their home. Aquatic wetlands are usually found at the edge of lakes and streams and may have water 3 to 6 feet deep, with many plants growing under the water or on the surface, such as lily pads. Many different species of fish spawn and feed in aquatic wetlands. Forested wetlands contain several types of trees that thrive in wet soil conditions, some growing to more than 20 feet tall. Few plants are present because of the acidic soil conditions. Deer, raccoons, hawks, and owls are typically found in this habitat. It has only been in the last 30 or 40 years that we have come to realize just how important wetlands are to the natural order of things. According to the EPA, wetlands are now known to be some of the most biologically productive ecosystems in the world, comparable to tropical rainforests and coral reefs in their productivity and the diversity of the species they support. Some of the most important functions of wetlands are they provide a very important habitat for the more than 5,000 species of plants that can only thrive in wetlands. 2,000 of these species are already considered endangered or threatened. They also provide an important habitat for wildlife that spend or at least part of their life in wetlands. It is also important to note that even many of the fish and shellfish that are harvested in deep open waters depend on wetlands for feeding and breeding. Wetlands also provide flood control by soaking up water like a sponge. 1 acre of wetlands can store more than 1,500,000 gallons of water. The improvement of water quality is also a very important function of wetlands. Water in a wetland moves around and through plants, allowing suspended sediment to drop to the bottom. Nutrients from farm and lawn furniture, or fertilizer, manure, this is getting long. Bear with me. Nutrients from farm and lawn fertilizer, manure, and septic tanks are absorbed by plant roots and microorganisms. Man-made and natural pollutants are filtered, diluted, and degraded before the water moves into lakes and rivers or is deposited to underground aquifers. As an example of how important this is, it is estimated that over 70% of Indiana residents get all or part of their fresh drinking water from groundwater through their wells. Wetlands are becoming more and more popular as destinations for recreation activities such as hiking, biking, birding, photography, fishing, and hunting. Many people enjoy just visiting to see the natural beauty of all the foliage and wildlife. They have become virtual laboratories for students to study wildlife, plants, and microbes, and are found in abundance in the wetlands. They have also become important research sites for scientists from many different disciplines. During the 1970s, we came to realize that not only were wetlands an enormously important part of our ecosystem, but we were also losing them at an alarming rate. Since the late 1600s, it has been estimated that we have lost more than 50% of the wetlands in the lower 48 states. As for Indiana, our wetland loss has been even more significant. In the early 1700s, wetlands covered 5.8 million acres, or 25% of this state. By the 1980s, 4.7 million acres had been lost primarily due to draining for agricultural purposes. Presently, there are only 813,000 acres of wetlands, covering only 4% of our state's land. In 1974, the landmark Clean Water Act was passed by Congress, which gave the federal government regulatory control over wetlands that join or drained into navigable waterways. That was the beginning of serious wetland regulation. We now have numerous federal government agencies involved in regulation, including the Environmental Protection Agency, the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the National Marine Fisheries, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, among others. Add to this list a whole range of state and local agencies with regulations ranging from the very benevolent to the very restrictive. As you might imagine, the product of all this bureaucratic stew can often be a lot of unhappiness for property owners and lots of work for lawyers. I read about a young couple in California who applied for a permit to build on 16 and a half acres of a 99-acre plot that they owned. They had the misfortune of owning property that contained some small wetlands and was in an area believed to contain some endangered species. The permit issued by the state had the following restrictions. They must, quote, establish with a conservation easement and monitor 38.8 acre preserve for the benefit of the Santa Cruz long-toed salamander and the California red-legged toad. Hire a service-approved monitor and a biologist, implement a construction worker education program, ensuring that monitoring of all grading, clearing, and other ground disturbing activities was done correctly, mark construction area boundaries, construct draft fencing around the construction areas, control trash accumulation, install screens on irrigation, electrical, and other equipment, surround the pool with a wall, and it goes on and on and on. Also include controlling bullfrogs. The conservation easement was held by the Center for Natural Lands Management, a not-profit conservation organization which was located in Fallbrook, California. This brings to mind a great quote from comedian Steve Wright, who some of you might remember. He has characterized one of life's great conundrums as, quote, "What are you supposed to do when you see an endangered animal eating an endangered plant?" While stories such as this make good fodder for the cable news pundits and tend to raise our blood pressure a bit when we hear them, they are fortunately the exception, not for the rule, except maybe in California. To be fair, on the other side of the wetlands debate are property owners who believe that it should be their right to fill wetlands with trash and junk and dirt, and developers who don't believe they should ever be required to preserve or mitigate wetlands on the property that they're developing. Though there are still many very contentious debates between those who are charged with protecting wetlands and those who own property where the wetlands are located, there seems to be a growing middle ground of reasonable people who understand that while protecting wetlands is important, and indeed is the law in many areas, consideration must also be given to the property rights of the owners. This has opened up a whole new area of law which deals with what are called regulatory takings. The law has long dealt with takings, but these usually covered the situations where the government took property from its owners through eminent domain for use on projects for the public good, such as highways and hospitals and schools. You may remember the controversial Kelo versus New London decision last year, where the Supreme Court greatly expanded the takings ability of the government by including the taking of land for commercial development and possibly for environmental purposes under the guise of ridding the community of blighted areas and increasing the tax base. Landowners whose land was physically taken by the government are entitled to financial relief under the takings clause of the Fifth Amendment, which reads, "Not shall property be taken for the public use without just compensation." President Reagan believed that property owners whose use of the land was so restricted by regulatory agencies that it significantly decreased its value were also entitled to compensation, and issued an executive order requiring all federal agencies to consider the potential cost to landowners when they were writing regulations. Excuse me a second. The federal courts soon began following the line of reasoning in the two landmark decisions of Loveladies Harbor versus United States and Florida Rock versus the United States. The courts provided financial relief to property owners who were injured by regulation of wetlands on their property. It is important to note that the courts have not ruled that wetlands aren't to be protected and preserved for the public good. They have only ruled that property owners who are victims of regulatory takings may also be entitled to financial relief. It is also stated that this whole area of law is still controversial and for the most part affects only federal agency actions, although some states are now adapting the concept of regulatory takings within their states. I would assume in the last 15 years since this paper was put together that there's been a lot of progress in this area. One other area of controversy regarding wetlands protection has to do with the reach of the federal government in its regulatory control. The Clean Air Act of 1974, which gives the government regulatory power over wetlands, had a seemingly straightforward restriction, which stated that the wetlands must be in navigable waters for the federal government to have any jurisdiction. Over the years, the courts have expanded the federal government's regulatory reach to include adjacent wetland areas that feed the navigable waters. This has led not only to conflicts with property owners, but also with state and local governments who believe the federal agencies are overreaching into areas that these local agencies should control. The Supreme Court recently decided a case that it hoped would resolve the controversy. The case was Raponas versus the United States and involved Mr. Rapona's assertion that federal government regulations that were applying to developing his property by filling in wetlands were not enforceable because the property was 20 miles from the nearest navigable waters. In a narrow 5-4 vote, the court ruled in favor of Mr. Raponas with the wording that the ruling did little to settle the controversy. Property rights advocates had hoped a ruling would weaken the government's regulatory power over wetlands, and wetland advocates, on the other hand, were looking for a broad interpretation of the Clean Air Act, resulting in expanded federal control over wetlands. Neither side was able to declare victory. You're welcome to come back up, sit if you like. There are many efforts within Congress to clarify the federal government's role in defining and regulating wetlands, but to date, they are still in various committees. Again, I assume in the last 15 years there's been progress here. In the meantime, a wonderful group of people right here in Fort Wayne has undertaken a very significant wetlands restoration project called Eagle Marsh. I'm sure you've all heard of it. That's what I was talking about with Betsy. I hope she was here. Betsy has been involved in this up to her ears since its inception, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. The organization that is heading this effort is the Little Rivers Wetlands Project. I'll tell you more about it in a minute. Eagle Marsh is a 675-acre site southwest of Fort Wayne, located roughly between Ingle Road on the north, I-69 on the west, Fox Island on the south, and a private wetlands area on the east. Little River has been able to purchase this land with a combination of public and private funding. In order to understand the significance of this project, some history of the area is instructive. Those of us who have lived in Fort Wayne for any period of time are familiar with the low flatlands that extend southwest of Fort Wayne down along the south edge of Highway 24 to the east side of Huntington. The actual geological history of this area is interesting and pertinent to the efforts to restore Eagle Marsh. During the glacial age, a very wide and thick glacier covered the Maumee Valley in Ohio and extended into eastern Indiana near Fort Wayne. As the glacier melted and receded, it sent very large quantities of water into Lake Maumee, which eventually overflowed, sending a river water to the southwest toward the Wabash River Basin, and then into the Ohio River. This water flowed through Fort Wayne moraine and followed the path of Little River. Over the years, large quantities of silt were deposited along the path of the river and eventually became deep enough at the limestone wall east of Huntington for the flow of water was blocked. The water impounded by this blockage backed up all the way to Fort Wayne in a very wide area and became a huge marshland, which encompassed 25 to 30,000 acres. It was called the Great Marsh. In 1887, the Fort Wayne Gazette described this area along the main line of the Wabash and Erie Railroad as a, quote, barren wasteland of swampland that stretches for miles along the track and extends on either side further than the eye can reach. In 1850, Congress passed the Federal Swampland Act, which ceded the state 1.26 million acres of marshland. And that included the Great Marsh. The act stipulated that the lands were to be sold for $1.25 an acre, and that the proceeds from this sale were to be used to reclaim the land. All the lands in the Great Marsh were sold in only a few days. During the next 20 years, nothing was done to drain the marsh, in spite of the fact that the Swamplands Act required the reclamation to be started within 2 years. There were many rumors about fraud and misappropriation of funds during the period. By 1870, there was increasing interest in draining the marshes, some of which stemmed from the belief that by many people that swamp gas, which rose from the bogs, was responsible for the epidemics and fever that had plagued the community. Finally, in 1874, an organization was formed to oversee the draining of the marsh. Surveys, engineers, and plans were completed. The plan envisioned converting 25,000 acres of marsh into farmland, improving the drainage of probably 100,000 more acres, and opening up the limestone deposits that I think we're all familiar with that are east of Huntington. Those opposed to the plan organized, remonstrances were circulated, lawsuits were filed, and the drainage plan was effectively stopped for the next 13 years. Those who opposed the plan thought it was too expensive, that the assessments were too high and assessed unfairly, and some thought that more farmland was not actually needed in any event. After 4 more plans, the opposition was overcome, and the draining project finally started in 1887 and was completed in 1889 at a cost of $137,017. I don't know what the $17 was for, but that's what history shows. The Great Marsh had suffered the same fate as the other 4.7 million acres of wetland that were lost in Indiana. Since that time, the area has served as very fertile farmland for the most part, although much of the 25,000 acres are still in a floodplain and some parts stay too wet for efficient farming. The mission of the Little River Wetlands Project is to turn as much of this land as possible back into the previous state of thriving wetland marshes. They have already completed the restoration of the Arrowhead Marsh and Arrowhead Prairie, which total about 188 acres and are located near the town of Aboit, southwest of Fort Wayne. The main project currently underway is 676 acres of Eagle Marsh, which will join Fox Island to the south and 2 private preserves to form 1,500 total acres of wetland restoration. This will be a habitat for plants and wildlife, many of which are endangered. Eagle Marsh is the 3rd largest wetland restoration in the state. Restoration of wetlands of this size is an enormous project that will take years to complete. For example, during 2007 alone, the restoration calls for planting 4,600 shrubs of different species and a total of 25,000 trees of different species. This is in addition to a large quantity of grasses and other vegetation that are being planted. Betsy was all involved in that and still is today. Those working on Eagle Marsh happily report spotting many species of birds and other wildlife that are already returning to the area. Some of you may be familiar that there are bald eagles nesting out there currently, which had never been seen in this area before. Private contributions are very important to the continued development and maintenance of Eagle Marsh, and it is a beautiful place. The Little River Restoration Project Group also offers a wide range of educational activities, from small informal classes on various wetlands topics, guided hiking tours in the marsh, and breakfast on the prairie, which I hope they still do. I went to a few, do they? Where you can go out and have breakfast and then go for a hike and you get a lecture during breakfast on a specific species, and then you go out and look for them after breakfast. Great fun. There was recently an evening class on salamanders, after which the participants donned their boots and went looking for salamanders as far as Fox Island. Information, times, and dates of all these activities can be found on their website at www.lrwp.org. This is a great opportunity to learn more about wetlands. I hope I've been able to make the case today that our wetlands are enormously important natural resources that must be preserved and protected. I also believe that we must find a less contentious middle ground that balances the need to preserve the wetlands with those of property rights. Education would seem to be an important component of achieving this goal. And I hope I've encouraged you all to visit, enjoy, and support Eagle March. I will leave you today with a quote from Teddy Roosevelt of 100 years ago in 1907. Quote, "A nation behaves well if it treats the natural resources as assets that it must turn over to the next generation, increased in value and not impaired." Thank you very much, and I appreciate your patience. Yes, sir.